So let me start by saying that the goal of this channel is not really to debunk religious claims. I'm not here to talk about why I think religious claims are false, primarily, although that's obviously going to be part of the subject matter. Rather, I'm more interested in exploring the consequences of religious belief, what religious beliefs mean, how they can change human lives, and so on. But at the same time, we can't really avoid the fact that there are sophisticated arguments in favor of God's existence. And so, while I don't intend to tackle these arguments in depth, for reasons I'll shortly explain, I do believe it's at least maybe interesting, if not exactly important, to talk about why I think a lot of these arguments fail. And today the focus will be specifically on what I call a priori arguments for God. So these are arguments for God that are made independently of perception, independently of any particular empirical facts. They are, to put it simply, intuitive arguments. These are arguments that we can make by sitting in an armchair, pondering the mysteries of the universe, and then coming to conclusions about whether or not God exists. Now, as I said, for now I'm not particularly interested in tackling these arguments in depth. Maybe in a future episode we will talk about each of these arguments individually and go into a bit more detail about why I don't think they're successful. But generally, I'm not going to talk about these sorts of arguments a lot on this channel for two main reasons. The first is that many people who are far, far smarter than I am have discussed these issues in greater depth than I can ever hope to. If you want to understand why the ontological argument fails, or why the modal ontological argument fails, you're better off not listening to me, but to a professional philosopher of religion. There have been a lot of very sophisticated arguments put forward, both for and against these arguments for God. But the main reason that I'm not so interested in talking about these kind of arguments is that I don't think they really make that much difference. I think it's pretty clear that most people who are religious are not religious because of their exposure to these arguments, and most people who are non-religious are not non-religious because they have heard convincing rebuttals of these arguments. I think that these arguments serve primarily to rationalize the faith that people already have. They don't really succeed at bringing new people into faith. So consequently, I find these arguments a little bit self-indulgent, a little bit navel-gazy. I'm not sure if they really address any pressing problems of human existence. Let's say the argument from necessity is successful, and you have proven that because there are lots of contingent beings, there must be a necessary being at the start of the causal chain. Well, what have we really proven? What do we get from this? There is a necessary being. Fantastic. What am I to do with my life? What are my moral obligations? To whom should I pray? Which religion should I submit to? These arguments in themselves answer none of these pressing questions. So while I do find them interesting in a kind of purely academic sense, I will stress from the outset that I don't think much really hinges on these arguments, and their successful proof or disproof doesn't really change the basic facts of human existence. We're still largely alone and blind in this cold, dark universe of ours, and we still need to find a way to stumble through. And the proof of a necessary being is not really going to help us to that end. But at the same time, this observation doesn't really grant the atheist carte blanche to just dismiss theistic arguments out of hand. I think it is worthwhile addressing them. I think that there is some intellectual onus on the atheist to address and to attempt to refute these arguments, and so here we are. So in today's episode, of course, we're not going to address every single argument for God's existence there is, but at the same time, we are going to address a number of them simultaneously. As I mentioned at the beginning, here we are going to be addressing a priori arguments for God, so arguments based in logic or intuition that do not rely on any particular perceptions or empirical observations in order for their truth to be established. Put simply, there are, of course, many differences in these arguments, and we'll talk about some of them individually in a moment. But what I will try to argue here is that they are all going to fail, or they are at least dubious, for very similar reasons. And in this episode, we'll be discussing 8 of those reasons. Probably the most famous example of an a priori argument for the existence of God is the so-called ontological argument. There have been different versions of this argument made by Anselm, by Descartes, by Alvin Plantinga more recently, and we don't need to go into details about what these minor differences are, but generally the ontological argument suggests that the concept of God himself implies his very existence. So if we treat God as the greatest conceivable being, then the greatest conceivable being necessarily exists, because if we try to conceive of a being who doesn't exist, then by definition that being could not be great. In fact, I would say by definition that being could not be a being, but that's the general thrust of the argument, that for one reason or another, we can know that God exists because God represents something maximal, something perfect, and maximality, perfection, these imply existence. Another common a priori argument for God is the argument from necessary being. So this is the idea that everything in the world is in some sense contingent. So its cause lies in something that came before it, but the argument runs, we can't have an infinite chain of contingent beings. A contingent being, by definition, depends on something existing prior to it, and there can't be an infinite chain of prior causes. So the only thing which could start that chain of contingent causes is a necessary cause. So the argument runs that at the center of existence there must be a necessary being who started the whole chain of being into existence, and of course theistic philosophy will attempt to identify that necessary being with God. The Kalam cosmological argument, as popularized by Dr. William Lane Craig, to me is very similar. That states that everything that exists has a cause. There can't be an infinite chain of causes, so the chain must have started somewhere. That beginning of the causal chain is, once again, to be identified with God. Another a priori argument for God is the so-called modal ontological argument, popularized by Alvin Plantinga relatively recently. This is the idea that if it is possible for a necessary being to exist, then that being must exist necessarily. That is, it must exist in all possible worlds. Because by definition, if it didn't exist in all possible worlds, then it wouldn't be a maximally great being. Then there is the moral argument, which says something like, there are clearly objective moral values, and the only possible grounding for these objective moral values is in a being like God, in a perfect, transcendent being who is also, in some sense, morally interested. That is, God is the only possible kind of being that can ground moral values, and so if moral values exist, then God must exist as well. Now, I could be very justly accused here of giving short shrift to these arguments or of misrepresenting them in some way, but For the purposes of this episode, it's not really necessary to have a full in-depth understanding of what these arguments entail, because my arguments against them here are going to be on a more general level, which doesn't really concern the exact structure of the arguments. Again, my aim here is not to debunk these arguments or to show these arguments to be false, but to offer some general reasons why I don't think they can be trusted, or why they are, at best, dubious in nature. So, the first and most obvious problem with all of these a priori arguments for God is that they depend on the reliability of human intuition. They are intuitive and logical arguments that do not make reference to the world, and so their success depends on the reliability of human intuition and the human ability to make accurate judgments about the world independently of any experience. And this is problematic in the first place because in cases where we are able to compare our intuitions to empirical knowledge, our intuitions tend not to fare very well. So there have been a number of studies performed in the fields of behavioral economics and cognitive science, which show that human intuitions are at best fallible. At worst, they are reliably and predictably wrong. So the field of behavioral economics has long shown us that human beings are not actually super rational beings who are always making the most logical decisions available to them. Rather, their thought is governed by a number of what are termed heuristic biases. We make a number of shortcuts which allow us to make snap intuitive decisions, which unfortunately tend to be wrong. So there are biases such as framing effects, so framing the same issue in slightly different ways will cause human beings to make two very different decisions, which shouldn't happen if they are thinking logically and if their intuitions are accurate. Our thinking is governed by, for example, confirmation bias, that we look for supporting evidence for what we believe, where in fact we should be looking for disconfirming evidence for what we believe. A lot of the intuitions we have might be governed by things like the language we speak, or how old we are, what emotions we are feeling, but even the question of whether or not we are hungry can affect a lot of the decisions that we make, a lot of the intuitions that we have. Similarly, there has been a lot of work done in cognitive science concerning what have been termed folk mechanics. So folk mechanics are these basic intuitions that people have, possibly from birth. They don't appear to be taught in any way, which give us intuitions about how certain things in the world are likely to behave. So our folk mechanics includes folk biology, so our intuitions about how biological organisms behave, folk physics, so our intuitions about how inert objects are likely to behave, and folk psychology, so our intuitions about how people are likely to behave. The big trouble here is that where our intuitions can be empirically tested, they are typically found to be wanting. So in the field of folk biology, for example, people have very deep-seated intuitions about the nature of biological taxa. As we discussed in an earlier episode, people tend to be essentialists when it comes to natural kinds, and so when it comes to biological organisms, they tend to believe that each organism is a representative of a fairly fixed and stable natural kind. Now, our knowledge of evolution and genetics tells us that this essentialist notion of biological taxa is way off the mark. every organism differs in some small but important ways from other organisms of its kind. Gene pools are constantly changing. Organisms are constantly evolving. There is no such thing as stable biological taxa, even though our intuitions tell us that there should be. In the field of folk physics, we have a number of intuitions about the way that objects behave that are at best dubious. So one example might be the notion of causality. So causality is very important to, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument, but findings in quantum physics tell us that our intuitions about causality, at least at the most fundamental levels of the universe, are likely mistaken. Quantum physics doesn't really have any room for causality in our everyday sense. It doesn't exactly show that causality doesn't exist, or that there is no room for causality in other fields of science, just that we cannot take our intuitions about causality for granted as being grounded in the very nature of the universe. If the Kalam cosmological argument depends on our intuitive notions of causality being correct, then the Kalam cosmological argument, at least according to the findings of quantum physics, is in a bit of trouble. The claim that every contingent thing in the universe has a sufficient cause has to be demonstrated, not merely assumed. In terms of folk psychology, again, people's intuitions about what makes other people tick tend to be pretty well off the mark. So one common error, in fact I think I mentioned this in a previous episode as well, is the so-called fundamental attribution error. So this is a kind of essentialist thinking, again, where we assume that people have very stable and fixed personalities and that their behavior is ultimately a reflection of this deep-seated personality. But what this means is that people tend to overlook more proximate causes for people's behavior. So if someone is glum when we first meet them, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily a fundamentally glum person, that they have a glum personality. Rather, it might just be the case that they've had a bit of bad news. But again, human intuitions tend to downplay these sorts of factors and rush intuitively towards an essentialist conception of the human being, which, as I said, is fundamentally mistaken. So human intuitions tend to do pretty poorly when they can be empirically tested. Of course, people who make a priori arguments for God might suggest that the two cases are not really analogous, that just because human intuitions might be fallible when making economic decisions or when making decisions about people's personalities, that is not to say that human intuitions are necessarily mistaken about more metaphysical matters. So it's not necessarily the case that they are mistaken about the fact that a chain of contingent beings depends on their existing a necessary being at the start of that chain. In fact, they might even argue that this is logically necessary, that irrespective of what our intuitions are, that contingent beings cannot be their own cause, that there must be a necessary being to set this chain of contingent beings into action. And this brings us to the second major problem with all of these a priori arguments for the existence of God, and that is that a lot of the language used here is ambiguous. It's sometimes unclear what exactly is being referred to or what is being denoted by the language used. So when it comes to necessary and contingent beings, for example, it makes sense that contingent beings ultimately must rest in some necessary being, given how we define what a necessary being is, what a contingent being is. Yeah, I could even concede that it's logically necessary that contingent beings must ultimately have their foundation in a necessary being. But what exactly do contingent beings or necessary beings refer to in the world? How would we know a necessary being if we encountered one? There was a very famous debate on BBC Radio between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston in 1948, and Bertrand Russell basically made exactly this kind of argument. So he said that in his case, he knew what was referred to by the word necessity when it came to analytical arguments, so it makes sense to say it is necessary for a bachelor to be unmarried. That's an analytic truth. But when you start wading into ontological issues and you start talking about necessary being, what exactly does that refer to? It's unclear if these notions, like contingency and necessity, can refer successfully to actually existing things. And this is not just a problem with respect to contingency and necessity, it's a problem with a lot of the other language that is used in a priori arguments elsewhere. So a lot of the language in these a priori arguments tends to be derived from scholastic philosophy, so philosophy developed in the medieval period, particularly by guys like Duns Scotus, Aquinas, and so on. And this philosophy just sort of very casually helps itself to terms like essence, substance, causality, and so on, where, again, the ontological reference is a little bit unclear to me. I mean, you can talk about essences, and people can vaguely understand what you mean by that, but show me an essence in the world. How would we know if we have found an essence? How is it that an essence can have causal power? How is it that God's essence can be conspecific with his existence? What does all this mean? What does it mean to say that a being is perfect? What does it mean to say that a being is maximally great? Words like great and perfect are equivocal terms. They can mean different things in different contexts. What on earth can it mean for something to be maximally great rather than simply comparatively great in some specific sense? Now, there might be perfectly good answers to all of these questions, but the point is that these questions need to be answered. The terms need to be clearly defined. It needs to be completely unambiguous what it is in reality they are supposed to be referring to. Again, we shouldn't just be relying on our intuitions about what things like perfection or essence or greatness are. To put it another way, the kinds of concepts on which a priori arguments are constructed are at least as much in need of proof as the very existence of God himself. The third problem with a priori arguments for God is that they tend to lead different thinkers to different conclusions. And if our intuitions were fundamentally reliable, then you wouldn't expect this to happen. You would expect different people relying on similar sets of intuitions to arrive at very similar conclusions, but that is in fact not the case. So the most obvious example would be people from different religious traditions using similar intuitions and yet arriving at two very different pictures of how the universe works. So the difference between, for example, Christian theology, which posits that at the center of existence is plenary being, i.e. God, and you have the Buddhists who argue the exact opposite, that at the center of existence there is fundamental emptiness, there is constant change, there is nothing stable. But what's interesting about these two different worldviews is that they can be justified by appealing to very similar intuitions. So we've seen that the argument from necessity and the Kalam cosmological argument says that you can't have a chain of contingent beings. Everything that we see in the world is a contingent being. It's been caused by something else. Therefore, there might be, or rather there must be, a god or a necessary being to have originated that entire chain. Interestingly, the Buddhists actually agree with this argument to an extent. Buddhists also argue that all things that we find in the world are the product of dependent origination. In Pali, this is referred to as pratitya samutpada. You can see my Pali lessons are really starting to pay off. But the idea in Buddhism is exactly that. Everything is the product of dependent origination. Nothing can exist independently or by its own essence. Therefore, at the center of existence, there must be emptiness. So what is very strange here is that you have two religious groups operating under the same intuition about the dependency of existing things on prior causes, and yet coming to two completely opposite conclusions about what that dependent chain of origination actually means. And just as importantly, people operating within the same religious tradition can have divergent intuitions about how the world must be. So in Christianity, for example, there's been a long-standing debate about the kind of knowledge that God can have about future human choices. So on the one hand, you have Calvinists who would argue that God can have perfect knowledge of people's future choices. The future is, in a sense, predestined. A lot of Muslim theologians make a very similar argument, appealing to the concept of qadar. And this basically states that there is no decision that a human being can make that God does not already know beforehand. And this obviously has pretty severe consequences for the scope of human free will. On the other side of the argument, you have open theists who argue that actually God doesn't know what human beings are going to do. Human beings have genuine libertarian free will, and therefore God cannot predict what human beings are going to do. God can merely react to human choices. So this comes at the cost that God really is, in some sense, a contingent being, a being who is subject to change, and who must exist in time. He must be a temporal being. And between these two extremes, you have a position that is sometimes referred to as Molinism. This states that God can have sort of conditional knowledge of what human beings are going to do. So he knows what we would do, let's say, in particular situations, but there is still some scope for human free choice. Now, the point is that all three of these positions depend on a priori arguments. We can't simply ask God what he knows. There is no empirical evidence telling us what God knows. These are arguments that depend on human intuitions about what God might be like. But we have three different conclusions being drawn from very similar assumptions about what God is like. These are all intuitions that are being drawn from within the Christian theological tradition. So how is it then that we are getting three very different answers to the same problem? And that brings us to the fourth problem with a priori arguments for the existence of God, and that is the problem of the intractability of disagreements. That is, if you have two people who are using their logical intuitions to come to two very different conclusions, how is it that we can decide which one is correct, which one is incorrect? Well, the big problem here is that we can't. If we have a disagreement about some other issue, for example, the nature of human psychology, the nature of physics, these are questions where our intuitions can be tested against empirical experience. So if I believe that causality exists in one sense, but someone else has a different intuition about how causality works, we can study the world and actually find out, at least in principle, which one of us might be correct. But when we depend on purely a priori arguments, when these arguments depend not on reference to the world, but on reference to logic or to intuition, there doesn't seem to be any clear external standard we can appeal to in order to clear up disagreements. So when a Christian argues that dependent origination is proof for the existence of a necessary being, and a Buddhist argues that dependent origination is proof that there is no necessary being and that existence is fundamentally empty, there is no way of deciding which view is correct. The main problem here, as Christopher Frugge argues in a paper called Unbunking Arguments, a case study in metaphysics and cognitive science, quote, "There is no independent way to corroborate our metaphysical beliefs and intuitions. There is little external support for the verdicts of many metaphysical intuitions and beliefs, because there is no uncontroversial set of metaphysical facts to which we have access. This problem is exacerbated given that we have little initial reason to think that we are particularly good intuitors of the joints of nature." And he quotes here Ladyman and Ross, who say, quote, "Proficiency in inferring the large-scale and small-scale structure of our immediate environment or any features of parts of the universe distant from our ancestral stomping grounds was of no relevance to our ancestors' reproductive fitness. Hence, there is no reason to imagine that our habitual intuitions and inferential responses are well designed for science or for metaphysics." End quote. Now, that is not to say that there is no prospect of metaphysical questions ever being solved or of us ever reaching some kind of agreement about deep metaphysical issues, but the problem is that these are necessarily just going to rely on further intuitions. There's sort of no way of breaking this intuitive cycle. And if anyone wants to argue that their intuitions are superior or more veridical than someone else's intuitions, and that therefore their a priori arguments are superior to the a priori arguments of others, then at the very least they're going to need to find a pretty strong and robust way of defending that claim, and I'm really not sure where that is going to come from. It seems to be that if we are depending on a priori arguments, we are depending on intuitions all the way down, and that's going to make it very, very difficult to resolve disputes when people have disparate intuitions. The fifth problem with a priori arguments for the existence of God is a little bit more philosophically subtle, and I confess that there might actually be good responses to this in the philosophical literature. I've certainly never come across them, but this might be a question that has a cogent answer. But the fifth problem is the lack of clarity, in my eyes, about how logical or analytical arguments can somehow grant us empirical or synthetic knowledge about the actual state of the world. So when we talk about truths in philosophy, these are often divided into so-called analytic and synthetic truths. So analytic truths are truths that we can ascertain just by analyzing the language or the concepts at the heart of something. So, for example, it is an analytical truth that all bachelors are unmarried. If we analyze the nature of the concept of a bachelor, the fact that a bachelor is unmarried sort of falls out of that analysis as a necessary truth. Syllogistic arguments are also analytically true in this sense. So if I say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, this is an analytic truth. We don't need to know anything about Socrates or men in general to know that this argument is true. Conversely, there are synthetic truths, and synthetic truths are truths that we typically know from our engagement with the world. So the fact that there is a table in front of me, the fact that the sun exists, these are synthetic truths. These are truths that we can only know through experience. Now, my problem here is how exactly it is that we can use the so-called analytic truths of a priori arguments to better understand the nature of the world. So, for example, if we take the previous syllogistic argument, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is analytically true, but is it synthetically true? Here, the argument as it is presented doesn't actually tell us anything about who Socrates was. So if we take the first premise, all men are mortal, well, I would agree with that, but is it really a synthetic truth? There are many religious people who would disagree with that claim. Christians would say that Jesus is not mortal. Some Taoists would say that Lao Tzu is not mortal. Some Buddhists would say that the Buddha or various bodhisattvas are not mortal. Socrates was a man. Well, this is a synthetic claim. Did Socrates really exist? If we change the form of the argument, so we say, all men are mortal, Sherlock Holmes was a man, therefore Sherlock Holmes was mortal, have we really learnt that Sherlock Holmes was a mortal? At what point can we say that this analytic argument is really granting us synthetic truths about the nature of reality? So in the case of, let's say, the argument from necessity or the Kalam cosmological argument, we can certainly say that it appears to be the case that a series of contingent events appear to necessitate, well, a necessary cause. That's simply the definition of what necessary and contingent things are. A contingent thing is a thing which requires a cause. A necessary thing is something which requires no previous cause. But what can this actually teach us about the state of nature? Are there really contingent things? Well, if contingency depends on causality, then as I mentioned before, the fact that quantum physics appears to have no place for causality in its model of the world is a problem for the existence of contingent beings. If nothing can really stand in a true causal relationship to anything else, then contingent things simply don't exist. Is it possible for there to be necessary beings? Is it possible for there to exist something which has no prior cause as the sufficient reason for its existence? Well, how can we possibly answer that? There certainly appear to be things in nature which exist without any clear prior cause, so things like beta decay in atoms, for example, don't appear to be caused by anything else, but it would seem a little bit strange to say that the phenomena of beta decay constitutes some kind of necessary being, or if we define necessary being as that which exists in all possible worlds, well, what does that mean if there is only one possible world, if there is only one reality? Isn't there the danger now of modal collapse? We can simply say, well, everything that exists in this particular way, in the only particular reality there is. Therefore, in a sense, everything is necessary. It couldn't have been different. So we're getting into some fairly philosophically rarefied territory here. I don't want to go too much deeper down this rabbit hole, but I'll simply say that for any a priori argument, there needs to be some demonstration of how it is that these logical analytical truths, and they are undoubtedly truths according to some definition of truth, but how it is that they relate to synthetic truths, and how it is that we can take some analytical truth and infer some synthetic truth from it. How exactly do we get over that analytic-synthetic divide? So the sixth problem with a priori arguments for God is the fact that even if these arguments are in some sense successful, the problem is that they really only grant us very broad brush knowledge about God at best. They give us a set of conclusions which are very sort of vague and general and ambiguous. And so again, even if they are successful, even if we can say they do demonstrate the existence of a God, we're still left a little bit in the dark about what exactly this God is like. So, for example, there are a priori arguments which attempt to demonstrate that God, as a necessarily perfect being, must have moral perfection as one of his perfections. So, in other words, God must be omnibenevolent because perfect beings are, by definition, omnibenevolent. Now, this is already a pretty dubious argument as far as I'm concerned. I don't see any particular reason why even a being which exhibits other kinds of perfections must necessarily have moral perfections as well. In fact, it seems pretty clear to me that moral perfections undermine God's other perfections. So, for example, a being who is omnibenevolent cannot really be omnipotent because his scope of action is significantly restricted by his need to do only that which is good. But this is, an argument for a completely different episode. But even if we believe that this argument is successful, that a perfect being must also have the quality of moral perfection, it doesn't really tell us anything about the nature of God's goodness. So what does God actually believe is good? Does he think euthanasia is good? Does he think abortion is good? Does he think that any of the wars fought in his name have been good? Well, we don't know. The mere bare fact of God's goodness doesn't answer these questions for us. Is God obliged to do good things in the world? And if so, what do these intercessions actually look like? The problem is that even if we are able to define into existence an omnibenevolent God, it doesn't really tell us anything interesting about God, or indeed what we as human beings are duty-bound to do next. And the seventh and final problem with all of these a priori arguments for God is the related problem that these arguments tend to grossly underdetermine the phenomena they purportedly define into existence. So, for example, even if we want to argue that the Kalam cosmological argument is correct, it can only really tell us the minimal fact that some first cause exists, not that a being with the properties traditionally attributed to God exists. So other cosmological arguments are going to run into the same problem. The argument from necessity, which says simply that there is a necessary being, well, okay, again, it doesn't really tell us anything about what this necessary being is like. Why couldn't there be a more minimal kind of necessary being which doesn't have any of the ostentatious properties traditionally attributed to God that exists in God's stead? So many religious traditions have developed concepts which appear to serve a similar function to God in the theistic traditions, namely concepts which serve as a kind of foundational being or ultimate reality, but which don't have the kinds of properties traditionally associated with the God of the Abrahamic faiths. So in Taoism, of course, you have the concept of the Tao, which, as Lao Tzu said, is the mother of all things. So everything that exists is essentially an emanation from the Tao. The Tao is the singular unity which underlies all existence, and through various degrees of emanation or separation, it eventually breaks down into what Taoist tradition calls the 10,000 things. So everything that we see in the world is consequent to the process of the Tao differentiating itself and giving rise to different kinds of beings. So the Tao in Taoist philosophy serves as a kind of necessary being, or as the sufficient cause for everything that exists, much like the God of the Abrahamic faiths. But of course, the Tao doesn't have any of these properties like consciousness, love, moral concerns, and so on that we traditionally ascribe to God. There are other similar concepts to be found in other religious traditions, such as the Brahman of Hindu tradition, the Logos of ancient Greek philosophy, Ma'at in ancient Egyptian theology. All of these are posited as kind of ultimate superordinate concepts which explain all of reality and which are fundamental with respect to reality. But in none of these cases, typically, can these concepts be thought of as describing something like the traditional god of theism. And this is a problem for these a priori arguments, because if all you have proven is that there is some kind of necessary being or some kind of ultimate sufficient cause which explains the existence of all things that we currently see, there is no good way to distinguish which of these particular concepts is superior or which is to be preferred. So even if we do accept that there has to be a necessary being at the center of reality in order to explain all that there is, that doesn't tell us if this ultimate reality is like the god of theism, a god which is conscious, which loves us, and so on, or if it's an entirely impersonal kind of supernatural concept, like Brahman, like the Tao, like Ma'at, and so on. Now, of course, you can always continue to pile argument on top of argument, intuition on top of intuition, and try to explain why a theistic conception of the universe is superior to, say, a Taoist conception of the universe. So I know that Dr. William Lane Craig, for example, has argued that whatever this necessary being is like, it must have a kind of mind. I'm not going to recapitulate this argument because I think it's spurious, first of all, but also it's going to take us pretty far afield. But the point is that these a priori arguments for the existence of God, even if they are successful, do not actually prove the existence of something that is recognizably God-like. All it does, at best, is prove the existence of some bare, necessary being without giving us any clear indication of what that necessary being should look like, or what particular concept of a necessary being best fits the kind of being which is supposedly necessitated by these arguments. But of course, a religious person might actually take some consolation from this, so they might concede, yeah, okay, different religious traditions have come up with very different ideas using similar a priori intuitions about what the ultimate reality looks like, but they at least share the common conception that this ultimate reality is in some sense supernatural, that a purely materialistic view of the universe is insufficient to explain, well, the existence of the universe itself. But I would argue that these arguments don't even get us that far. Even if you want to posit a necessary being or a first cause, there is no reason to assume that that necessary being or first cause has to be supernatural, or that it has to be anything other than an utterly mundane, physical, blind, and dumb sort of being. So there have been naturalistic attempts at defining what a necessary being might look like. So, for example, there is Ladyman and Ross's concept of ontic structural realism. I won't go into this, exactly what it involves, and that's convenient for me because I'm not sure I properly understand it. But basically, the idea is that what is foundational to all existence is some kind of structure. That no matter what it is that you take to exist, it is founded on structure. That is what is foundational as a necessary being. Whatever there is has to have some kind of structure. Other physicists have attempted to argue that something like a universal quantum wave function could also serve as a necessary being. So there doesn't appear to be anything we are familiar with which causes the universal quantum wave function, but at the same time, the universal quantum wave function appears to undergird all existence. All things that exist appear to be derived or to depend on the existence of this foundational quantum wave function. So I'm not saying that either of these arguments are successful either, but the point is, it is at least conceivable that there is a necessary being which the arguments we've talked about successfully identify as existing, but the arguments themselves underdetermine what exactly that necessary being must look like. So we have several different possible candidates for what could serve as necessary being, and the point is that none of these a priori arguments give us any indication of which of these sorts of necessary beings are to be preferred. Does the argument from necessity prove the existence of God, or does it simply prove the existence of a universal quantum wave function? Well, the mere bare identification of a necessary being doesn't really lend support to either of these specifically. It lends support to a very general, underspecified kind of necessary being, and therefore it doesn't really lend any particularly robust defense for the existence of God, even if we presume the argument is successful. So those are just a few of the reasons why I think we can at least be skeptical of a priori arguments for the existence of God. But just before we finish, I think it might also be worth pointing out that the same sorts of criticisms can be leveled against atheistic arguments against the existence of God. So if we consider the so-called logical problem of evil, for example, perhaps one of the most famous atheistic arguments against God, this states something like, God is a perfectly good being. A perfectly good being would not allow gratuitous evil to exist in the world. Gratuitous evil exists in the world, therefore God cannot exist. So here, I think we're facing a lot of the same problems that we've already discussed in relation to theistic arguments. So we have the problem that much of this argument is constructed on moral intuitions about what gratuitous evil would be like, about what a perfectly moral being would or would not allow. And these intuitions are not necessarily veridical. I mean, can we really trust our ability to predict what an omnibenevolent being would do in a particular kind of situation, or what kinds of evils he would allow? We have the problem that terms like good and evil are equivocal in a sense. They can have different meanings in different contexts. Different people can use the terms to refer to different kinds of things. There are intractable disagreements about what constitutes good, about what constitutes evil. There is some indeterminacy about exactly what kind of being is ruled out by this argument. So I would say the argument is successful in ruling out a particular Christian conception of a god, because Christianity is very wedded to this idea that God is omnibenevolent in a really appreciable sense, but other religious traditions do not have this problem. They do not really have a problem of evil. In Islamic theology, God's will is so utterly sovereign that it cannot be imagined that he would be beholden to any external force, like the necessity to do good, which would restrict his will in any way. So in Islam, there really isn't a problem of evil, because the logic really is, well, if God wants to do evil things, or at least things which we see as evil, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to stop him? God's will is sovereign. That's all that matters. So even if the logical problem of evil is successful, we have at best only ruled out a very specific Christian conception of God rather than God in general. Schellenberg's hiddenness argument, another very popular atheistic argument at the moment, runs into very similar problems. So the argument from divine hiddenness is something like, God is a loving being, he desires to have relationships with human beings. If he desired to have a loving relationship with human beings, he would make himself apparent to them, or at least to non-resistant non-believers. He, in actual fact, doesn't make himself apparent to all people, as a supposedly loving God ought to do. Therefore, in all likelihood, given his hiddenness, he probably doesn't exist. Now, again, I think this is a pretty good argument. I think that this really is a pretty deep theological problem, why it is that a supposedly loving God who is interested in the travails of human beings would make himself so inaccessible, but it doesn't really work as an a priori argument against the possibility of the existence of God. Again, we're depending on intuitions about what we think that an all-loving, omnipotent being would actually do, and how reliable really are our intuitions about the behavior of this kind of being. Are we really justified in intuiting that a loving God would desire to make himself apparent to us in particular ways? Well, how can we possibly know? Like, what kind of experiences can we possibly have that would confirm or disconfirm our intuitions about this kind of being? Loving is a fairly equivocal term. There are different ways that we can love. There are different ways that we can demonstrate our love. So it's not necessarily the case that being hidden or aloof is incompatible with literally every possible sense of the word loving. It's left a little bit indeterminate about exactly what kind of God we are ruling out here. So the argument from divine hiddenness rules out a God who is in some sense interested in having relationships with us, who is in some sense loving, but where does that leave us exactly? What kind of God exactly is ruled out by that sort of vague definition? So generally, a priori atheistic arguments are also likely to be unsuccessful because there are pretty simple ways for any theist to sort of wriggle away from the conclusions that these arguments appear to demand. So basically all a theist needs to do in order to, well, not exactly to disprove these arguments, but at least to cast doubt on these arguments, is to say something like, no, that's not what we mean by goodness. No, that's not what we mean by being loving. No, that's not what we mean by a relationship. No, that is not what we mean by God. And, you know, there can be some kind of value in forcing the theist to make these sorts of little concessions. So in forcing the theist to concede that God's goodness and human goodness might not necessarily be conspecific, or in recognizing that the relationship with the divine is at least a little bit strange, it's at least not perfectly compatible with the notion of human relationships. I think these kinds of concessions are still pretty theologically damning because it does undermine a lot of the intuitive basis of religious belief, these complacent notions about God's goodness and God's lovingness. They have to be clarified a little bit, and they have to be reformulated as something a little bit alien and strange. But these arguments do not really threaten the concept of God, because, as I've said, all you need to do to escape the consequences of this argument is to redefine what you mean by some of the key terms. And because a lot of theological terms like God and goodness and love and so on are very slippery to begin with, this is very easily done. So the point is, yeah, there are no good a priori arguments in favor of God, that they're all going to be at the very least dubious because they depend on particular intuitions and particular equivocal uses of language and so on. But unfortunately, exactly the same problem is going to occur with a priori atheistic arguments against the existence of God. So as unsatisfying as it might seem. I don't think there are any particularly good arguments in favor of God. I don't think there's any particularly good arguments against God, at least if we are relying purely on a priori or intuitive arguments. So next time we'll look at an a posteriori argument, the argument from fine tuning, and we'll see if that fares any better. But until then, thanks very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. See you again next time.